I'm Dr. Renee Marinelli. I'm the med school coach, director of advising. I was on the admissions committee at UC Irvine, and we have Dr. Sahil Mehta with us, who's an interventional radiologist, and he is the founder of Med School Coach. And we have one of our newer advisors, Dr. Ziggy Yoedino. I hope I said it right, Ziggy.
Yeah, very good.
Who's a psychiatrist and was on admissions committees at a bunch of different schools that you can see there. Do you guys want to just take a minute to introduce yourself? I know Sahil, you kind of already did, but.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, thanks everybody out there for joining us. We're excited to have you guys. I'm Sahil. I'm the founder of Med School Coach. I've been doing this for a long time now and helped a ton of people through the admissions process and sat on both sides of the admissions committee, both obviously as an applicant years ago, but then also evaluating applicants for medical school, residency, fellowship. So I think I have a pretty good idea of what it takes to get into medical school and everything beyond. And, I'm excited to be here tonight and help you guys through the process. And, Med School Coach is here for you guys throughout the process, no matter where you are. And Renee will talk a little bit more about that, as well as Prospective Doctor and the things that we can help with, both for free as well as if you need some additional help later on. But again, excited to be here. Thanks so much for having me, and thanks everybody for logging on.
Hello, Ziggy.
Hi, I'm Dr. Ziggy Yoedino, and as Renee mentioned, I'm a psychiatrist. I did my training at Harvard and had a lot of experience at Duke University working with pre-meds and interviewing medical school applicants. And I sort of wanted to channel those experiences in a more formal way, and that's why I ended up joining Med School Coach, and I'm very excited to be here and to be able to hopefully impart some useful wisdom to all of you.
Cool. Well, we got a lot of people signed on, so I say let's go ahead and begin. So let's start with a quick poll. So first question, how important do you think the personal statement is? Probably doesn't impact the application much. Some people may read it and put some weight on it, or it's very influential to the entire application. Give you guys just a little bit of time to answer that. All right, cool. All right, hold on, it's calculating. Let me show you those results. So most people said that it's very influential to the entire application. I do like the 1% that said it probably doesn't impact the application much. Way to think outside the box. But I think that Sahil and Ziggy can really agree with me that C, or the last one, is that it is very influential to the entire application. And I do agree a little bit with the middle one, that some people may read it and put some weight on it, but we'll go into that a little bit more. That's probably more for the bad personal statement, that some people may just kind of read it and go through it or not really pay that much attention. But for the most part, and using our experience on admissions committees and going through it ourselves, for the most part, it is very influential to your entire application. Great. So let's move on. Here. So, as I was saying, a lot of people will put weight on it. They want to read a good personal statement. So I think that one thing we always talk about with applicants is that you have to imagine being an admissions committee member at the school. Imagine you've got 10,000 applications that you need to go through. And yes, there are some admissions committee members that read every single application that they do receive. So let's say you have 10,000 applications. If you start reading a personal statement and it's bad, more than likely that admissions committee member is going to just kind of skim through it, look for any red flags and put it aside, or maybe not even read it at all. But if you have a good personal statement, then that admissions committee member is really going to want to read it, see all of its content, and really want to know more about you as an applicant. So it's kind of that initial stepping stone into a secondary application and interviews and moving your application further on the applicant pool for that school.
I can't
go
agree
ahead.
more with what Renee said there. And
Yeah.
I often like to say that I look for any reason to reject an application. Like the minute I have a reason to reject it, it goes in the reject file. And I don't care what that is. If it's bad capitalization, if it's a spelling mistake, if it's a crappy personal statement, if it's a boring beginning that says, I want to be a doctor since I was 1 year old, man, all those things go straight into the reject file for me. I don't know about you guys. I don't know what you guys think when you guys read, but that for me, when I read a bad personal statement, it's over. It's absolutely over for that applicant, unfortunately, and fairly or not. But that's the reality of sort of being on admissions committee, as Renee said, and evaluating thousands of applicants. You gotta sort through them somehow.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And a personal statement, especially as you said, and we'll get into that more, is that opening, those first few lines are really going to make or break your personal statement. They're either going to keep that person's attention or they're going to just want to move on and say, you know what, I've got 9,999 more applications to go through. I'm not going to waste my time reading more on this one. So let's start with just the basics here. So the personal statement, you're allowed 5,300 characters with spaces for the personal statement. This is AMCAS, so we'll mention the osteopathic application a little bit later, but we're going to focus right now on what AMCAS says. So that's about 1.5 pages typed, almost 2 pages. And here is the prompt. So I'm not going to read the whole thing, but the prompt is pretty vague. So this is what AMCAS gives you in the actual box on the application about what you should write about. So it's pretty vague. It doesn't tell you how to write it, what structure to follow, making it a 5-paragraph essay. You have to fill up the whole space allotted. It really doesn't give you those instructions. A lot of it is open-ended. But we'll talk about some of the finer details and what we think really makes a great personal statement. So, as again, there's really no one way to write the personal statement. I've seen tons of different ways. I've seen a lot of unconventional ways where people kind of just write an essay that maybe doesn't follow any guidelines or doesn't have a standard introduction or body paragraph. But there are some key components that I think make a good personal statement. One, as we mentioned before, is having an interesting introduction. As I said, and we'll go into this again because I don't think we can drive that point home enough, is those first few lines are really going to make or break that personal statement and make someone want to keep reading. I think the other thing that really makes a personal statement good is good content. So Ziggy will talk some more about the body of the personal statement and the content that should go into it. But really, in general, most good personal statements should explain your interest in medicine, why you want to be a doctor, why you want to go into medicine. You don't have to concentrate the whole personal statement on that, but you should have aspects of that. And then it also should really demonstrate your strengths as an applicant and what makes you unique against those thousands of other applicants that they have received. So those are really the key components that you should have in your personal statement. All right, so let's do a poll. Let me launch number 2 here. So this poll is, which personal statement opening do you think is best? And I know it's a little bit of reading here, so I'll give you a little bit more time on this one to check out the options.
Yeah, this is an interesting question you're asking, Renee, because part of the and Ziggy, maybe you can respond to this too. Everybody has a slightly different want in their personal statement when they sit on an admissions committee. Maybe you're going to get into this, but it's interesting, and I feel like from a student perspective, it's often really tough because they say they might show it to 10 different people, and 10 different people might have different initial reactions. So I wonder, Ziggy, maybe you could talk about this. Like, how do you tell somebody to maybe like figure out, when they get all these different pieces of information from all these different places, how to synthesize what they eventually want to write, or whose recommendation they're going to take?
Right, that's a tough one because you can talk to 10 different people and they'll have 10 different recommendations. And I think ultimately, in some ways, you have to sort of go with what you feel comfortable writing the most, basically. Each person sort of has a style and a flow that they're used to. And so if you're trying to write in a way that doesn't really feel comfortable, it's like fitting a square, into a circular area, then it's not going to work very well. I think it's good to listen to what everybody says, sort of assess the pros and cons of everything everyone says and synthesize all that information through a filter that makes the most sense for you, and then apply it to the writing style that you've kind of been used to. You want to have confidence in your own writing style too. So you don't want to have so many naysayers saying like, oh, this is not good, this is not good. You have to have some self-confidence, but it's always good to integrate some outside information, but ultimately writing in a way that you feel the most comfortable doing it, because it'll come across as much more genuine at the end of the day.
Yeah, absolutely. So we got most people voted. So let me end the poll and show the results here, which I think are pretty interesting. And I kind of made this poll a little tricky because I wanted to emphasize Sahil's point here, is that everybody's going to have a slightly different opinion about the personal statement. I think everybody, for the most part, there's a few of you that said number 2 was the most interesting. And I would bet, a decent bet in Vegas that Sahil and Ziggy would probably say number 2 is the least interesting to them.
Yeah. Definitely.
Right?
Yes.
So from an admissions committee standpoint, this is so typical. We've seen so many applicants that write, their first sentence about their dad being a doctor, their aunt being a doctor, some miraculous, thing that they saw when they were younger and really pushed them on this path to being a medicine. So, or being a doctor. So this is very typical. And to us, having read thousands of personal statements, this would be more boring. Sahil and Ziggy, what do you guys think about the other options?
I really like, the other 3 are definitely much better than the second one. No, the third one really stood out to me, I have to say, just because it was such a unique situation, basically, and it's okay if you haven't been to, dealt with earthquake victims, but it really just paints a picture, which I think is what you really want to do at the end of the day for whatever you're writing.
Mm-hmm. Sahil, any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, this is again a little bit personal, right? It's like what makes a good introduction, and for me, it's what makes me want to keep reading. Like that's the bottom line. What makes me want to continue to read on to the next sentence? Because myself, along with a lot of other admissions committee members, will only read that first sentence and decide. And so for me here, I mean, I honestly think that. And this is personal, like that rock wall one kind of makes me interested in that person a little bit more, right? I want to understand who they are and what they're talking about. Maybe they're a rock climber. I assume maybe they do something crazy. So to me, that's interesting. Now, that's not to say that, if you're not a rock climber, you can't write an interesting personal statement. I mean, there's different ways to write it, but I think that hopefully hits home to the point for all you applicants out there that, I mean, that intro is just so important, because I think the most important part of all this is if I read that one that said medicine has always seemed like a natural course for me, I'm done. Like, I'm done with that personal statement right there, and I won't read anymore.
Yeah, thank you. I think those are great points. And so that's kind of why I put this poll up here, because 1 and 3, I put those from a couple people that I worked with their personal statements. And I thought 1 and 3 were some of the most interesting introductions I've read. 1, as Sahil said, just kind of really makes you curious. And then you're wondering, this is a medical school personal statement. How are they going to relate rock climbing back to going to medical school and being a doctor? So where are they going here? So I thought that it really catches the reader to really think, let me see where they're going. Let's see how they relate this back. Number 3, I thought, as Ziggy said, really painted this picture, this kind of like picture of Sayaka and what is this guy doing, with a temporary shelter with earthquake victims. I mean, it really opened up more questions that wanted you to keep reading. Number 2, I agree, very typical. I would stop reading it. Number 4, I kind of put this one in here as a tricky one because I see a lot of personal statements that start out similar to this, where a pre-med talks about some type of experience in medical or in their volunteer experience where they thought was really interesting. Usually it has to do with like a code blue or an emergency situation. Whereas on the flip side, to physicians that do this every day, they know the grim nature of a code blue, and they know how bad when you get to chest compressions, usually things aren't going well. Usually we don't like to read this as much. I'm not saying that number 4 is wrong, and I think people can make it work, But in my opinion, and from ones that I've read, you're not going to really impress us with your medical experience at this point. You're pre-med, you're still doing volunteering, so having done chest compressions isn't going to really impress me or make me go, wow, this person's had a wonderful experience. I think it kind of is a little bit superficial, if that's the right word. Any thoughts on that one, guys? Because I know we do see a lot of personal statements when someone shares their medical experience.
I completely agree. I mean, the fourth scenario is something that, you know, every physician, healthcare provider, and their mother really knows about, basically. And so unless you can talk about chest compressions in a way that no other person has really talked about it before, I would sort of avoid that, because there's, you know, a lot of people are already going to list it for their extracurricular activities. They're going to list it in some other way, basically.
Yeah.
So if you can find a situation or experience that is quite a bit more unique than that, that would be the way to go, in my opinion.
Yeah, I mean, I would say talking about medicine, talking about specifics of medicine to try to impress the admissions committee is a fail. Like you're likely going to fail by doing that. And I can't tell you how many personal statements I've read in students I've worked with, their first draft, they may have shadowed a neurosurgeon for 1 million hours. But the reality is they try to write intelligently about something medical sometimes, or I'm struggling to say that what I want to say, because I don't want to discourage people from writing about their medical experiences, but I do want to discourage people from thinking or trying to impress the admissions committee with specific medical knowledge, because you won't. You'll just fail.
I completely agree. Yeah, I think that's a good way to put it. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the introduction. So let's move on here. So again, try to be unique in your introduction. You, like Sahil was just saying, you don't have to talk about medicine. And you saw from those other examples that those really had nothing to do with medicine. But we'll see a little bit later on when Ziggy talks about the content of the personal statement, you can really link it back to medicine and demonstrate your strengths by whatever theme that you're setting out in that introduction. So that's another big thing, is I really encourage people to establish some type of theme in that first paragraph. Usually the last couple of sentences, where it kind of documents about what they're going to be talking about. So maybe that rock climber, you know, went on to say something to the effect of that, how rock climbing has really strengthened his perseverance and resiliency, and these are similar qualities he's had on the road to going to medicine, or something to that extent, obviously in a more eloquent, well-spoken way, but using that example of rock climbing or the earthquake temporary shelter to really illustrate your strengths and give the reader a little bit of a glimpse of what you're going to be talking about later. So there we go. So here's a couple other personal statement examples that I think are good. Again, everybody's going to have slightly different opinions on this, but I like the way that these readers had really made it something kind of outside of just medicine, or these writers. You know, these aren't really just saying, I want to be a doctor because of this, or when I was in the hospital and I saw this, or this, it made me want to be a doctor. They're obviously talking about something in their experiences that really impacted them as a person. And they're going to give you a glimpse later on in the personal statement how those experiences have contributed to who they are and their strengths. And we'll kind of go back to a couple of these ones too, to see how you can see that how these people have used these personal statement introductions and then wove it into some of the content. So Ziggy, I'll hand it over to you if you want to talk a little bit about the body of the essay.
Sure, absolutely. So I like to eat a lot, so I want to use a food analogy, basically, which is to say that if you think of the introduction to your personal statement as the appetizer, then the body of your personal statement is going to be the entree. And so this is the part where you're really going to develop and bring to life the theme that you introduced in your riveting introduction. And this can be accomplished in a few ways. You know, first, similar to how you should be writing your introduction, you want to continue to utilize an interesting writing style. And a common problem I've seen, and maybe you guys have also with personal statements, is they often read like laundry lists because a lot of the sentences tend to be structured along the lines of I did X, I did Y, and I did Z. And this does not make for an interesting writing style. And consequently, it frames whatever content that you've included, no matter how impressive it is, in a very unflattering light. So it's like serving the most amazing food that you could create on a flimsy paper plate. And you do not want your writing style to resemble a flimsy paper plate. You want it to be a beautiful bone china, basically. And building upon what Dr. Marinelli said, an interesting writing style for me is about putting thought into crafting every single sentence you write so it paints a vivid picture of what you're trying to say and provides truly useful information. And so now to clarify, this does not mean that you should purposely write sentences that are long and convoluted and full of SAT-like words, basically. That will not come across well. It'll look very disingenuous, and it'll kind of be concerning in a not very good way. And of course, you never want to write anything in a way that can be construed as being arrogant. Now, the most interesting writing style in the world won't mean much if you don't have quality content to begin with. And where does this quality content come from? Well, it comes from your life experiences, whether it's through how you were raised or the extracurricular activities that you participated in. You want to utilize these experiences to demonstrate your strengths. But that also means that you need to figure out what strengths that you want to highlight and then figure out which experiences will best demonstrate them. And that being said, another problem that I've run across frequently with personal statements is that the applicants tend to include too many experiences sometimes because they think there's a correlation between the number of examples they include and the level of impressiveness. And consequently, their essays once again end up resembling a glorified laundry list. And so to remedy this situation, what I would do is pick a few meaningful experiences and then bring them to life with details that demonstrate passion, commitment, growth, and results. And the last thing I want to say about this slide is that you can see on the left a chart of things to avoid including in your personal statement. I actually think most of them are pretty self-explanatory, so I'm not going to go over it. But if you have questions about any specific items listed here, definitely ask it in the Q&A session.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, great.
Can I ask you a question, Ziggy and Renee? I have my own answer, but I'm interested and curious to hear what you guys would say. How many activities should a user bring in, or should a student bring into their personal statement? That's obviously a question that I get a lot from my students, and I'm wondering kind of what you guys answer to that.
Wow.
Yeah.
It's hard. I'm going to give the most unsatisfying response by not giving a specific number. I kind of think it depends on what they're writing about. There are some experiences that they can write about where maybe it's enough to fill the entire essay because there's just so much, rich detail to do. But if it's something where they're trying to list, trying to illustrate it with a few examples, I would say anywhere between 3 to 4 at the most, basically. I would try not to go over that because I think at that point, once again, you're getting to that gray zone of maybe looking like a laundry list and not including enough detail to bring the example to life.
I agree. We were going to talk about this, and I'll kind of jump ahead, but usually the best personal statements are somewhere around like a page in length. I think probably most of you can agree. I always tell people that it's really quality over quantity, so you don't want to just use that whole 5,300 characters just because you can. It's going to become redundant, or it's going to become boring to read. That is a lot of content to fill up 5,300 characters. So I usually aim somewhere for about a page, a little bit over a page. And usually that turns into like 2 to 3 experiences that most people talk about, kind of because then they can talk about it in a depth that really does show those strengths and their uniqueness and their character, and not come off as just a listing of different experiences like Ziggy was talking about. Cool. Let's go to the next slide, which goes on for a couple of those personal statement intro examples that I had put. This is a little bit of their body in there. Ziggy, you want to comment on these?
Yeah, absolutely. Are you able to put the second
Oh,
statement
whoops,
on?
I'm sorry. Yep,
That's okay.
there it is. Okay.
Okay, so develop your unique content. So on this slide, as you can see, there are paragraphs from two different personal statements. And even though one is about being part of GlobeMed and the other one is about teaching in Thailand, they both share similarities in terms of why they make for good paragraphs. And simply put, you can read it yourself. What I got from it was that they both convey, in an interesting writing style, the passion they felt for the extracurricular that they were involved with, for their respective experiences. And it also illustrates the challenges that they faced and how they grew because of these experiences. And in other words, once again, they're painting a very vivid picture for the readers. And I also want to clarify something about the title of this, since it has the word unique in it. You may be seeing that word and then looking at these paragraphs about, this person, teaching in Thailand and the other person working in an impoverished part of the world doing a health project. And you might be thinking to yourself, oh my gosh, I have never done anything as unique as this, basically. What am I going to do? So I just want to clarify, the word unique in this context doesn't mean that you have to be involved with something that very few medical school applicants have been ever done before. In fact, I would say that a lot of medical applicants are involved with activities that would be considered quote unquote common, for a lack of a better word, basically, something like doing research. So what we mean by developing your unique content is taking, again, one or a few of your experiences that you consider meaningful and bringing it to life with how it impacted you. And there's only one you, and that's what's going to make your content unique. And again, not to sound like a broken record, but I'm going to repeat myself. But once again, that means picking a few meaningful examples, bringing them to life with details that demonstrate passion, commitment, growth, and results. And the last thing I just want to add about this slide is that, writing an amazing personal statement takes a lot of work, which is why you should start as early as possible. A top-notch personal statement goes through many, 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 many drafts, and it ideally includes feedback from others. So if you think that it's just going to pour out of your head onto the paper and you're going to have this perfect finalized thing, you're going to be very disappointed, because that's not how it works. And even the most gifted, talented writers, the Hemingways of the world, have to do lots and lots of drafts.
Yeah. No, that's great. And I keep smiling. I'm sorry, because we've got a couple chatters out there that are making me smile. So while you're talking about that, Ziggy, people are saying that I'm going to have to start rock climbing, and someone's saying they need to do a lot of pull-ups to get strong, and then they'll go join the rock climbing. So
don't do it.
You guys can know that rock climbing actually involves a lot of lower extremity strength, and actually it's actually a falsehood that you have to have upper extremity strength to do rock climbing. It's all about the lower extremities. So whoever's doing push-ups out there, or sorry, pull-ups, and you'll figure it out.
Someone said grip strength too. That's very important.
That's probably important.
Oh, okay.
I think though that this is a good little bit, you can kind of answer a question as we're talking about this though. What do you guys say for those people out there that are like, I don't have any unique experiences. Like, I'm a pre-med, I've gone to college, I've volunteered in the hospital, I've done research. What should I talk about if I don't have these, extraordinary experiences? I know you kind of touched on this, Ziggy, but can you, Sahil or Ziggy, give any examples of kind of more typical experiences that you see people writing about?
Yeah, I think a common experience is, doing research. I think that's something that a lot of people do. I think, most medical school applicants applying to particularly research-oriented medical schools are going to have to do research. And for a lot of them, that's going to be a very meaningful experience. I think, again, it comes in the details, basically. If you just write, I did research for a few years and this is what happened, like, yeah, that's like a terrible thing to write. But if you can really delve in and paint a picture of why this research mattered to you so much, how it helped you grow, what kind of results you got, how you were able to develop as a leader and a team player and interact and make mentors. You know, if you ask yourself all these questions about your own experience, I think you're able to flesh out a lot of details and paint a really amazing picture of something that maybe you would normally consider commonplace. And that in and of itself will make it a quote unquote unique personal statement for you.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, to me, it's all about the writing style. Um, you can make, as Ziggy actually mentioned, you can make relatively mundane things like research interesting to a reader and convey your passion for it and medicine. Or conversely, you could make it really boring and do a bad job of it. So you don't have to have the most amazing experiences, even if you are a typical pre-med and have just done the basics. You can write about it in a way that conveys passion, that conveys interest, that conveys excitement about medicine, and that's what's going to separate you.
Yeah, and I just want to add, Renee, if you don't mind, I just wanted to add as a cautionary tale to not put something in just because it seems like it's going to be a razzle dazzle, Hollywood style unique experience that nobody's done before. If you're only doing it for the sake of impressing people and looking unique, it's going to really show through, and it's going to make you look disingenuous, basically, and that's worse than being mundane, quite frankly.
Yeah. Yeah, and I totally agree that it is about your writing style, and then it's also about what you're trying to emphasize in there. If you talk about your research and you're like, I went into the lab every Friday, and this was my experiment, and it's going to just sound like the description in your AMCAS. So instead, talk about the initiative you took in the lab, about how you researched extra hours, how you spent time, looking at journals and reading different journals, or solving problems that maybe other lab mates couldn't solve. Or maybe you could talk about, maybe you just volunteered at like a clinic, but instead of just going there 4 hours a week, bless you, you really took the initiative to set up outreach, or got resources for patients, or kind of did something outside of the box. That's what's going to show your uniqueness. Not the activity itself doesn't have to be unique, but your uniqueness in your activity. And that demonstrates your strengths, your initiative, your drive, your motivation, all of those things that they want you to see or they want you to have. That's how you demonstrate them. Even if you feel like those activities are mundane or very common, you can demonstrate your uniqueness in them. Cool. Well, we're getting a lot of great questions, so I'd love to kind of wrap up here. Sorry, let me go back, and then we can get to the Q&A, which I think is always the most fun, and I will try to answer as many questions as possible. But just some final thoughts. As Ziggy mentioned, start early. I usually recommend people starting in January or February, because you're going to tear up a bunch of drafts and you're going to go through different things. You're going to get lots of people's opinions. People are going to give you different thoughts and opinions. And so it's going to take a while to finalize your personal statement. Just to mention, for MD and DO, the DO personal statement is shorter, but you can usually, what I have people do is write their MD personal statement and then modify it to be a DO personal statement if they're applying to both. And usually you can do that by modifying some of the content where you express your specific interest in osteopathic medicine in there as well. If you copy and paste, which most people are going to write it in Word and then paste it into the AMCAS application, be careful. There is formatting issues. Like, I don't think you're able to tab. You're only able to space out paragraphs. So be very careful with the formatting issues. And then once you copy and paste it in there, proofread it, and then proofread it again, and have someone else proofread it. Because as you've looked through this personal statement so many times, you're going to miss some small mistakes, because your mind is already going to read what you think it should say. So you may miss a the, you may miss an and, or something like that, because you've just looked at it so many times. So I always say, when you're like at your final draft, have like your mom or your best friend read it for grammar and syntax. That's it. Don't ask them to give you any comments, because you've already made a draft that you like. Just ask them to do a final proofread, and that will help you feel confident that you're submitting it without any mistakes. And then ask for help. As Sahil mentioned before, we are definitely here to help you guys. We want to help you guys. We have a team of about 50 advisors that have served on, have served on admissions committees. We wrote our personal statements to get into medical school. We got into medical school somehow. We all did it. So we have this experience personally, but also seeing and reading thousands of personal experience or personal statements. So we want to use our experience to help you. So check us out. You can ask us questions about it, and we have different editing packages to help you through the personal statement and make sure that you're going to submit a well done personal statement. So without further ado, let's start answering some of these questions. Any final thoughts, Ziggy or Sahil, before I start pulling on some of these questions here?
Yeah.
I don't right now.
A couple of other quick thoughts just for you guys who are out there before we get into the Q&A of places to go for help. The perspectivedoctor.com website, which you guys see the little logo on the bottom right there, is awesome. It has tons and tons and tons and tons and tons of free articles and content, as well as a podcast. The webinars are on there. So you guys should really go check that out. There's tools in terms of like how to select your school list. It's just like a great place that's not student doctor, because student doctor is crazy in a lot of ways. And so it's a great idea for you guys to just check it out, read examples and ideas from true experts in the field, as well as subscribe to the podcast so that you can, sort of just listen and understand what people in the field are talking about, from admissions, from MCAT, to being a doctor. So we cover all those things. Renee actually hosts that podcast and covers all kinds of different topics that are interesting to pre-med. So just a couple of other places to find some information for you guys out there that I think will be super helpful for you, whether or not you're looking for that extra help. Obviously, if you're looking for that extra help, if you're looking for a physician who has been on an admissions committee to read your personal statement and give you feedback, then go to medschoolcoach.com. We'll go through some of the options that we have there, or contact us and we can help you figure out some of the options you have there to get actual professional help through some of these things. But again, that we have a ton of resources on Perspective Doctor, as well as the podcast. So to check those out.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. And Sahil, we're getting a lot of questions about having the PowerPoint and the recording of this webinar available. So I know we always do. How do you plan on sending that out?
So the best way to get that is actually to go to and make sure you subscribe to our social media stuff, because that's actually where we post it. So go to Facebook and like us on Facebook so you get it. Go to Twitter, like us on Twitter, and Instagram as well. And we'll post links to the webinar as well as our YouTube channel. And I'll actually send out that YouTube channel on the chat right now. So if you subscribe to that YouTube channel, you will automatically get the webinar recording when it's available, as well as all the other webinar recordings as well that we have. We also have a bunch of other stuff on there that you guys should check out. Again, I think there's just a bunch of interesting a bunch of different interesting videos to help you in your process here.
Awesome. Cool. Thanks, guys, so much. So let's start hitting some of these questions. There's a lot of great questions out there. We'll try to get to as many of them as possible, and I'll try to combine the ones that overlap a little bit, so hopefully we can kill a few birds with one stone. So one question that I've gotten a couple times here is, if there are red flags, or if you had a semester of bad grades, like due to an illness or something like that, should you mention this in your personal statement? Ziggy, I'll give this one to you.
Well, yeah, I think if you feel like it's had a major impact on your academics and extracurricular for some reason, and you really feel like it's a noteworthy thing, that it doesn't hurt to mention it in your personal statement. I think, people on the admissions committee reading that will be understanding of it if you really have a convincing reason. If it's something that's not a very good reason, then I definitely wouldn't do that. But if it's something where it was like a major illness, a major life event, or something that had this really big impact, if you can really discuss, you can talk about it, and maybe even talk about how it impacted your outlook on becoming a doctor or something like that, that's something you might want to consider.
Yeah, and I agree. I think red flags or things like that are good to explain in your personal statement, but what I always say is to just caution, don't make your whole personal statement about that.
Exactly.
You don't want to wave the flag out there. You want to point to the red flag, explain it, maybe spend a few sentences, but you don't want to just draw glaring attention to it. So you have to do it, in a nice, succinct way that explains it, gives its justification, but you're not using it as like a sob story or making them try to feel sorry for yourself or giving excuses for, different deficiencies, but really providing a context for it. Sahil, I have one for you, and this is kind of segueing off this question, is how personal should the personal statement be? Like, should somebody write in there about a mental health illness that they suffered or other personal events?
Yes and no, right? So yes, I think that a personal statement should delve into who you are and what makes you who you are, right? I say that with a little bit of caution because if you're totally crazy, I don't want you to talk about how crazy you are. But at the same time, if there's a illness, if there's something that you've gone through that even is a little bit on the cusp, or maybe you question whether you should talk about it, the reality is you probably should talk about it. But I would say get an opinion on it first. Get our opinion or somebody else's to make sure, because I've seen it both ways. So I guess I am completely for you putting in very personal information. I mean, it's a personal statement after all, and we want to get to know you. At the same time, you want to make sure that you don't overstep the bounds or talk about something that is going to turn off a huge swath of people. It's got to be a balance.
Yeah. And I would just add, to piggyback off what Sahil said, you don't want to write anything that's going to give the impression to the admissions committee that it's somehow going to affect your ability to function in medical school too, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So that's, I think, another important thing to mention.
Yeah, that's a great point, is making sure that you can provide that, but provide that context of maybe how it made you stronger, made you into a better person, not just saying, I suffer from X, Y, and Z, and I'm going to have these limitations in medical school. That can make it a little bit difficult. Try to make it a story more about how you persevered or how you came out of something. I'll go ahead and tackle this one. So somebody asked, what extent is there going to be overlap from the AMCAS activities section in your personal statement? So for those of you who aren't familiar, in AMCAS, you're allowed 15 slots for your activities, where you get about 700 characters to write about a description of activity, and 3 of those you mark as most meaningful, where you're allowed an extra 1,300 or so characters to really expand on that experience and talk about why it was so important to you. So a couple things here. There is going to be some repeat, more than likely, between those 15 activities and what you put in your personal statement, unless you're just like, you've done so many things, you've already populated that whole list of 15, and then you have extra things to talk about in your personal statement. That could happen, but I don't see that. Typically, there is some overlap. I try to discourage people from talking about experiences that are in their most meaningful experiences and then in their personal statement. And the reason for that is because that can lead to redundancy. So let's say they said that their trip to Africa was one of their most meaningful experiences, and they go on about the things they did in Africa. If they go back and talk about that in length in their personal statement, well, it's going to be like reading the same thing over again. However, the caveat to that is, if there's really different aspects you can mention. So let's say you talk about your trip to Africa and your most meaningful, and you talk about really the things you did, but then in your personal statement, you talk about a particular situation or a particular person you met or something like that, then in that case, I think it can be okay. And that redundancy is okay because you're really portraying a different aspect in your personal statement. Otherwise, expect to have some overlap between the activities and the personal statement, but try to keep the content of them different. Somebody asked, Sahil, what about somebody that's a reapplicant? How similar does their personal statement, can it be, or does it have to be different?
Yeah, good question. Question we get all the time. In my opinion, it should be different. And the simple reason is You're a reapplicant for a reason. You've hopefully done something interesting or something more in the course of a year. And admissions committees have access to your previous personal statement. So to write the same exact thing is a big no-no. Now, if you want to keep some of your themes the same, if you want to, include a couple of the activities that you talked about last year in this personal statement because they were so important to you, I'm okay with that. But I do think that you should take a fresh new look at your personal statement if you're a reapplicant.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. Ziggy, I got this question a couple times. What about for the people, they're wondering if my MCAT score and my GPA aren't high enough, am I going to be filtered out automatically, or will people still read my personal statement?
No, you won't be filtered out automatically. I think that's why the personal statement comes into play, basically. And that's something where you have control over, basically. So, if you're kind of concerned about your MCAT and your grades and things like that, writing a really dynamic personal statement can help sort of, tip the balance a little bit, somewhat, hopefully, basically. And that's one of the things that's really in your control. And that's why it's important to really start early and take the time to write many, many drafts to write that personal statement, because that's an area where you have a lot of control, can make a big difference, basically. So I wouldn't, if you don't have the kind of grades and MCAT scores you have, don't automatically cut yourself out of the running at looking at certain schools just because you're worried about that. Of course, you have to be realistic at the kinds of schools you look at. There's no such thing as a safety school in medical school. They're all hard to get into, basically. But at the same time, don't think that you can't get into a top school just because of that. There are other things that they tend to look at, personal statement, letters of recommendation. If you get a secondary application, they'll look at that. So there's a lot of other ways where you can sort of make up ground if other places are lacking.
Yeah, absolutely. Sahil, let me throw this one at you. Somebody wrote, and I'm just going to read it. I'm more of a writer of factual things instead of like a novelist. How much of the personal statement is judged by style versus substance that it contains? An interesting question.
Yeah,
I don't think we're all good writers out there.
I think the reality is that this is dependent on who reads your personal statement that day. There are those people who are more interested in reading something that's, again, an interesting writing style, something that envelops them into the piece in front of them and makes them want to read more. That's not to say that every single person out there should try this super flowery language and all of a sudden, want to be Emerson, in everything that they write. But I think it does point to that, you should try to at least grasp the reader's attention, even if that's with facts, right? Even if that's not with something that's super flowery, that's totally okay, but you should still try to grasp that reader's attention.
Yeah. And I just want to add, Renee, that I don't think it has to be an either or situation. I think you can write facts in a riveting style, basically. And while some people might write in a flowery style, there are also other styles that aren't flowery, but that are still captivating to the audience. There's a lot of authors out there who write in a quote unquote simple style, but it really captivates the audience. So I wouldn't try to pick between one or the other. I think, in this case where you're competing against so many other people, you really want to try to do everything as well as possible and not, think like, oh, I can do this, but not that, basically.
Yeah, absolutely. I've gotten a lot of questions about kind of red flags in the personal statement. So let me take a stab at some of red flags. Somebody asked, based on one of our slides, what is name dropping? And I think we listed that as like a relative contraindication. So name dropping would be like, I worked with Dr. Smith at X university. Dr. Smith won the award for greatest surgeon of the year 20 times. And name dropping would be like that. Like you're trying to essentially brag about someone you worked with or somebody that wrote you a letter of recommendation or something to that extent. You're not trying to show off, that you worked with some important physician or some important researcher. You don't want to do that in a personal statement. Somebody talked about if you had a typo in your personal statement, like, would that throw out your application? I say yes or no. And I think, again, echoing what Sahil said, kind of depends on who's reading it that day. I think in general, if it's like one typo, more than likely people are going to say, okay, that's one typo. The rest of their application was pristine. I'm going to keep considering this one. And I think so they'll go on and to continue to consider you. But if you have multiple typos or spelling errors or things like that throughout your application, that's a no-go, because that just shows that you didn't even put the effort into really making it good and really taking the time to go through the entire application. Somebody just asked if you're a career change or professional school changer, does that look like a red flag? And absolutely not. If you change careers and you're going from uh, tech to medicine, that's not a red flag at all, but really you want to use the personal statement to help explain why you're making that change. And I think the other thing that's important is convincing the reader that this is the correct change for you, because they're going to be wondering, oh wow, you had this 6-figure job in tech, why are you throwing that away to go over to medicine? So you want to make sure that you are doing a good job convincing them that this is a good change and this is what you really want to do. Sahil, I'm going to throw a question at you that we get all the time. How do you explain why do you want to become a physician?
So we could talk for a few hours on this one.
Exactly.
Right.
How do you explain it? How do you explain the personal statement, right? So I think we should go back for a second to what not to do, which is talk about the fact that you wanted to be a doctor ever since you were born. Talk about the fact that when you broke your arm in first grade and you saw the physician, all of a sudden you knew that was what you wanted to be forever and ever and ever. Talk about your fourth cousin who, went to the emergency room vomiting and was treated for gastroenteritis and their life was changed, right? I mean, these are things that I think those are not good reasons for wanting to be a doctor, right? So what are good reasons for wanting to be a doctor? I think truly having a passion for what it is that we do on a day-to-day basis, which is connecting with people, helping them through, or at least seeing them through some of the most difficult portions of their life. I think that's one facet of wanting to be a doctor and a good thing to potentially talk about, or at least that connection. But that's a little bit different than what a lot of other physicians do, right? A lot of other physicians are really interested and really do a lot of great medicine because they're interested in how amazing medicine really is, right? I mean, think about how far we've come in the last 30 years and in the last 100 years in our understanding of the human body and its pathophysiology and how we actually treat disease. I mean, it's crazy to think that, only 50 years ago, we weren't treating any of the diseases we are today the way we are. And it's actually completely true that probably 50 years from now, we're going to look back and say, what the hell were we doing today in hacking people open for surgeries like this, or taking out appendices, or whatever it might be, right? So, I mean, there's so much change in medicine. There's so much amazing technology. There's so much impact that one can make. I mean, I guess these are some of the things that I would hope that if you are a pre-med going into medicine, that's why you're going into medicine, or some of the reasons maybe that you're going into medicine, and then talking about that or explaining that, I think is where you want your personal statement to go. Hopefully that answered the question somewhat.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, like you said, we could spend hours talking about this. It's a huge topic. And I think, as you had mentioned before about getting help and asking somebody that's had experience writing personal statements and reading personal statements is a great place to start if you're not totally sure how to verbalize why you want to be a physician. Or maybe you feel like the reasons why you want to be a physician are too generic. Having a conversation with an advisor or a friend or a mentor or something like that can really help kind of develop your reasoning into something a little bit more eloquent and more unique to put in a personal statement. I'll answer this question real quick. Somebody asked, what level or education level should my writing be aimed toward? Like, how technical should I get? And I think that's a pretty interesting question. I would say try to keep it basic. You're definitely going to be writing to people at least high school level of above of education. Most people on admissions committee are going to have a college education of some kind. Admissions committees are made up of physicians, secretaries, nurses, ancillary staff. I mean, there's all kinds of people that go onto admissions committees, so you want to make sure that you are addressing that broad audience. And usually the mistake I see most commonly is that somebody is talking too medical or trying to use like really in-depth medical terms to like make it sound like they know a lot or sound impressive. But you have to remember that not everybody reading it is going to be a doctor, and doctors that are reading it probably won't be a press like we touched on earlier. So try to make it basic language that's understandable, about the college level or above. Ziggy, what about this one? Somebody says, I'm a pretty humorous person. Is writing in a light comedic style frowned upon?
Wow. I think, I think it depends, everything in moderation, basically. You don't want your personal statement to come across as a big joke, but if you have a certain style that you can sort of, thread through in an appropriate way, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. You just don't want to come across, again, it's like going to extremes. You don't want to come across as being flippant or disrespectful or, introducing some kind of humor that people aren't going to get, basically. But if you can put it like, if you really feel like you're a humorous person, I think if you can put like a light touch, it's sort of a reflection of your personality to an extent. But the main thing is that you want to do it in an appropriate manner, that it's not going to be offensive to anybody.
Yeah, absolutely. I totally agree. I've seen some where people try to just do too much stuff and make it too funny, and it just doesn't come off professional or serious. But if you can put like a little light spin on it or make like a couple things that allude to, like you said, your personality, I think you can make that work. But again, as Sahil said, for some of these more questionable things where you want to include some comedy, make sure you're having someone else read it. Make sure you're getting multiple opinions. So even though you may think it may be good, somebody else reading it may not. Try to get a consensus at least on what you should and should not include. So we're coming up here on 10 o'clock. I know it's getting late for everybody. Let's see, any final questions we want to touch on? Maybe like one more. Sahil, this is kind of going back to what we talked about with content and why do you want to be a doctor, but a few people have asked, like, if I've had a traumatic experience, like I was involved in a motorcycle accident or my mom's cancer, really impacted me, is that okay to talk about in your personal statement?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, no doubt about it. Like you should talk about things that truly have had an impact on you. I mean, almost use it as a litmus test, right? If you're writing about it and you're grappling with, hey, well, how did I really feel at that time, or what can I say to make this look good? Then it's not a good thing to write about. But if you're writing about it and if you write about your parent who had cancer, like that is an extremely relevant thing and something that is personal and something that no doubt about it, like you're going to have feelings about and something that may have shaped you. So, I mean, use common sense, right? I mean, don't try to stretch something that isn't real. If you've had an experience that's truly shaped you, absolutely, you should write about that.
Great. Awesome. I totally agree. Well, let's wrap up here. We got a lot of questions. I know we didn't get to everyone's question, but please feel free to reach out to us. We'd love to talk more about all of these questions. I'm also going to keep these around and do some podcasts on these. Hopefully Ziggy and Sahil might join me as well, or some of our other advisors. And so definitely try to keep following us on social media. Go to perspectivedoctor.com. A lot of these questions that were not related to the personal statement and the ones that are written about on our Perspective Doctor blog. So probably, I think all these questions have a blog post pertaining to it. We have tons of content there. So definitely visit prospectivedoctormedschoolcoach.com. We'll give you all this information, and pay attention to my podcast too, because I'd love to go through a lot of these questions and just spend as much time as I can answering the ones we didn't get to today. Guys, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Thank you. Have a good night, everyone.
Thank you, everyone. Happy New Year.